Augustus, and you should have read a little bit more of his City of God. How were the City of God reads to you?
They were good. I just didn't get one of the chapters.
Okay. Quickly, if you can quickly summarize some of the main ideas that you got out of that.
Augustine was mostly arguing about the fact of how stars and the heavens can't predict everything, not every hour of the day, and challenging the idea that, like, how is it possible that the stars can predict when I'm going to
I can't hear your audio. Your audio cut off. I'm not sure if I'm the only one.
Can you hear me?
Okay, I can hear you now.
Do I keep talking or?
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, he
I can't hear you again. Hello? Am I the only one having trouble hearing her?
I can't hear right now.
Okay, yeah, we can't hear you.
Yeah, I think it's my connection.
Okay.
Sorry.
No worries.
Oh, by the way, my camera isn't really working today. I don't know
Okay.
why it didn't work.
No worries.
Yeah.
Try it again one more time. Sarai.
He's challenging the notion of how the stars can predict when we're going to eat, when we're going to sit down, or every hour of the day. And he relates this to how twins are born in the same day or hour of time, and how is it that if they were born under the same constellation, that they have different fates, ideas, or destinies. And he also compares Jacob and Esau for that.
Awesome. Great. All right. Who else read the Augustine article? And I can share a little bit about it.
It was a little difficult for me, man. Like the first chapter was hard for me to even understand. But they were, I believe it was talking about the differentiations of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. But I did get a little confused, but might need some clarifications later on. Forgot what part do I need. I didn't bring my note, but yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So let me summarize Augustine in a nutshell, especially his City of God. Essentially, just like Sarai was saying, Augustine wants to make this, he makes an analysis or an argument that God is in the center of everything. And although there's free will, although there's ideas or possibilities where each person is able to choose their direction, at the end of the day, God has complete control. So Augustine makes the arguments that things don't happen out of luck or out of coincidence or because the sky is a certain way, but everything happens because God has permitted it. And as a historian, Augustine, as a historian, give me a second. Okay. As a historian, Augustine makes the analysis that history or time is determined because God has allowed it and God has permitted it to happen. So that's essentially what I wanted us to read a little bit about Augustine. So let's get started on today's stuff. We're going to review slightly the imperial era or the end of the imperial era. Then we're going to discuss the medieval era from 476 to 1453, and we're going to look primarily at the historical content outside of the church realms. So by that I mean Charlemagne's rule. We'll discuss briefly the Black Plague. We won't get a chance to cover the Crusades today. We will talk about them next class, and we'll enter into the Reformation era from that moment on. And then within the confines of the church, we're going to talk about how the role of the Pope increased both politically in the secular and also within the church. We will explore the expansion of the church, uh, as the church grew in numbers, but also how the church grew in political spheres. And then we'll look at another council, the Council of Constance, and then lastly, look at the division of the church. Or before the Council of Constance, we'll look at the division of the church between the Eastern and the Western Church. So, any questions about what we will be talking about today? Awesome. So let's take a quick look at the eras that we're covering. Once again, the medieval era ends in 476 with the fall of Rome. We've discussed a few of um, the moments of why Rome fell. We discussed a few key figures: Athenius, who was influential in the Council of Constantinople. We discussed Constantine, and we're going to be discussing a few more figures today. Most of these facts you've already covered in your reading. I just want to do a small emphasis on some of these figures because they're kind of those elements that transition from one period to another. As I start reminding myself about the medieval church, I'm a little disappointed in the way that Jesse Hurlburt just kind of puts a whole bunch of events into the medieval era. Of course, once again, his historians categorize it differently. But as I started exploring it, I think the church went through monumental moments during the medieval era that could have been broken down a little bit more. So, uh, the imperial era concludes with these key figures. We discussed Augustine already. Augustine was a brilliant scholar. He came to the faith through his mother and some of Ambrose's teachings. We'll cover Ambrose in a bit. He was the bishop of Hippo in northern Africa in 393, and his popular works are City of God and his own confessions. He's one of the most influential historians one of the most influential theologians that came since the time of Paul. So let's get started. We'll talk about Ambrose. Ambrose was born in 340 and he lived till 397 AD. And he was one of the earliest Latin fathers. He actually helps that transition or interpretation of Latin for the biblical times. He's elected bishop, and prior to him being a bishop, Ambrose was a layman, so he just went to church. So most bishops during that time period were either some sort of clergyman or contributed within the church. But in this case, Ambrose was just a regular church attendee who was devoted to the church. He wasn't baptized. Ambrose never got baptized. He received instruction for membership, but he wasn't actually baptized inside the universal church. And he was a commanding figure who rebuked Emperor Decidius. He helped in that conversion, or he tried to help convert Decidius, especially in confession and repentance. And he was influential because he wrote many theological books and helped bring Augustine to the faith, which we discovered Augustine in more detail. John Chrysostom was a phenomenal preacher. He was born in Antioch between 345 to 407. He was known as the Golden Mouth because of his oratory skills and just his development of the gospel or preaching the gospel. He was known as a patriarch in Constantinople, so he was a famous bishop. He was a famous speaker in Constantinople, the former capital of Rome. At this point, it's still known as Constantinople. Once again, Rome falls in 476. He's known for preaching at Hagia Sophia, the church that we talked about, that illustrious building that was created when the churches were being redeveloped. And then lastly, he was a reformist who was displeased with the direction of the church. So we're going to talk about some of the downfalls in the church momentarily. He's sent into exile and dies in 407. The last figure that we will be speaking about today is Jerome, or the last figure that we're going to be speaking about in the imperial era is Jerome. Jerome was very educated in literature and oratory. He was a very well-known oratory figure, so a public speaker. And while he was dedicated to that, he left it all to live a religious life. So he left it to live a life. He's one of the earlier monks. He establishes a monastery in Bethlehem, and Jerome is known most of all to have translated the Bible into Latin. So the Bible was in its original languages in Greek and Hebrew, and he translated it into what is known as the Vulgate, which is gonna uh, introduce some controversies later on, as we're gonna see in the medieval era. And then the Vulgate becomes the official and authorized Bible of the Roman Catholic Church. So those are our three or four figures that we've discussed. These were the last leaders of the imperial era. They help in that transition that we see in the medieval church. However, as we were speaking about last week, the church becomes known for its development of a further hierarchical structure. So as we watched in the video last week, not only did we have clergy or priest, or not only did we have clergy, so we have now the development of priests, development of bishops, the archbishops, and then the Pope. So as the hierarchy of the church begins to develop, there's less key figures that are in the lower spectrums of the hierarchy, which is why we're going to be discussing a lot of the papal power today, how the Pope becomes the predominant figure of the church. So do we have any questions about that? If not, great. Once again, if you have any questions, feel free to interrupt me. Feel free to make any comments. If I'm going too fast or too slow, let me know. And we'll get started. So the medieval church begins from the fall of Rome in 476 to the fall of Constantinople in 1453. So we're going to look briefly at the history of the Roman Empire's decline. We'll look at the establishing territories that develop in what was known as Rome. And then we'll look at the fall of Constantinople at the end of the era. So I want us to realize that Rome was no longer an empire by this time. It was a bunch of different countries or territories that were established from barbaric tribes. I mentioned a few of them earlier. There was the kingdom of the Visigoths, the kingdom of the Vandals. You have the kingdom of the Burgundians, and essentially all that territory that once belonged to Rome. If you remember the images that I showed you guys previously, I believe, I don't think this is one of the clear ones, but essentially Rome is covering all of this colored portion that's not in green. Are you able to see the image, the mapping? Yeah, great. So Rome is in there, and eventually that territory becomes this. So as you can see, after the fall of Rome, these Berber tribes begin to invade or begin to take over. Of course, the fall of Rome was contributed mostly to the Chinese and these tribes. So we see how they begin to develop and take territories here. After a while, after these territories become a little bit more established and more stable, these are going to form some of the more modern countries that we see today. It still will be another few centuries before that happens, but you can see the development of these territories. So I'm going to share with you a video briefly about Charlemagne. Charlemagne was the emperor that helps reestablish the Western European countries and region. In 800 AD, Pope Leo III crowns Charles Augustus as Roman Empire or a Roman emperor, and after Augustus, Constantine and other emperors. So it starts off with power over France, and he conquers Western Europe, Spain, Germany, and Austria. Charlemagne reigned with power, with wisdom, with reformed education, and influence of the church. So I forgot to mention in the beginning of class, there's a lot of concepts that we're going to be discussing in this class. So I've decided to incorporate a lot of video usage because these guys can explain some of these details far more better than I am. So I'm going to speak briefly about a certain time period or a certain movement. Then I'll show a video that's going to explain in more detail of what that is. So the first one is
715 and the Frankish
is going to explain briefly who Charlemagne is.
715 and the Frankish kingdom is embroiled in a civil war. It's quite complicated, but to summarize, it was a civil war not between men fighting for the crown, but for men fighting for the title of mayor of the palace, who was in charge of the king's household. In Francia, the king was basically a puppet to whoever held this position, and so people wanted it. There were supposed to be two mayors, one for Austrasia, which was hereditary, and another for Neustria. There was an attempt to merge both mayoralties by giving them both to an 8-year-old and revolt. A man named Charles Martel seized the opportunity that the chaos brought and managed to defeat his enemies in 718. Charles was given the title Duke of the Franks by King Chilperic II, who again didn't have any real power. Chilperic died in 720 and was replaced by Theodoric IV, who Charles had appointed. Charles saw to increasing the size of the kingdom, and by 730 it had expanded to this, with Charles conquering many of the German-speaking peoples to the east. To the west and the south, though, things weren't so rosy. The Duchy of Aquitaine had previously been part of the Frankish kingdom, but had broken away in the civil war and was now having trouble with their shared southern neighbour. This southern neighbour was the Umayyad Caliphate, which was, at this point, the largest and wealthiest empire ever assembled. The Caliphate, after numerous attempts, had started to conquer Aquitaine, forcing its Duke Otto to ask Charles for assistance. He granted it in return for Aquitaine's submission, and Charles mobilised his army and met the Caliphates here at the famous Battle of Tours, sometimes called the Battle of Poitiers. It was a decisive Frankish victory and was thus cemented forever as one of the most famous battles in history. The exact importance of the battle is fiercely debated, with opinions ranging from it merely halting further raiding to saving Christianity in Western Europe. Anyway, the Caliphate would try again in the following years, but failed, and by 740 it ceased to be an existential threat to Francia. So in 737, King Theodoric IV had died, and Charles decided he didn't need to appoint another king, and so he didn't. He didn't take the crown for himself, though, and still ruled as mayor until his death in 741. Before his death, the territories of the kingdom had been split between his sons, Carloman and Pippin. In 743, they both chose a new king, Childeric III, but as expected, he had no authority. The first half a decade of their joint rule saw several revolts in the east and some clashes in the south, but it was largely stable. In 747, Carloman renounced his title and became a monk, leaving Pippin as the sole ruler. By 751, Pippin didn't really see the point of Childeric remaining on the throne, and so with the consent of Pope Zachary, got rid of him. He proclaimed himself King Pippin III, the first of the new Carolingian dynasty named after his father. Pippin was an accomplished general and leader, but not as much as his father or his son, and so he isn't very well remembered. He did, importantly, begin the close relationship between the Frankish kings and the popes. Pippin lacked legitimacy, which he could gain from the pope, who in return would gain Frankish protection from the Lombards. Pippin aided Rome against the Lombard kingdom several times and carved out these territories for the pope to govern personally, the papal states. Pippin reigned until 768 when he died. He divided the kingdom between his two sons, Charlemagne the eldest and Carloman. Charlemagne's name comes from the Latin Carolus Magnus, meaning Charles the Great. So Charlemagne and his brother didn't like each other, but fortunately this wouldn't be a problem for long, since in 771 Carloman found himself slightly dead. As such, Charlemagne gained the rest of the kingdom, beginning his transformative sole rule. Charlemagne's first priority was war and expansion. Over the course of his reign, Charlemagne went to war with pretty much everyone, but the reasons for these wars weren't exclusively territorial, but also religious. To the northeast of the kingdom lived the Saxons, who were pagans and had raided the kingdom for centuries. In 772, Charlemagne launched a raid to destroy the sacred Saxon tree called Irminsul, beginning decades of warfare and forced conversions in the region. 773 saw conflict between the kingdom of the Lombards and the Pope, and Charlemagne, who wanted to maintain this prestigious relationship between the Franks and the papacy, came to the Pope's aid. It was a quick war, and the Lombards were defeated the next year when Charlemagne captured its capital, Pavia. He thereafter proclaimed himself as the king of the Lombards, but did keep the territory separate from Francia proper. He also conquered the Duchy of Spoleto and gave some authority over it to the Pope. The war with the Saxons continued at a grindingly slow pace until they rallied behind a man called Widukind. Charlemagne was unhappy with this, and so in 782 he ordered the execution of over 4,000 Saxon prisoners, and in 785 Widukind accepted baptism. The decades following this saw major expansion of the kingdom, starting in 787 with the subjugation of Benevento here. The next year the kingdom expanded further east with the integration of Bavaria and the conquest of Carinthia, which brought the Franks into contact with the very wealthy Avars. It wasn't long before war broke out between the two, and the Franks, led by Charlemagne's son Pippin, invaded. The Avars had lost by 796 and their royal residence, called the Ring, was sacked. Immediately after this, Charlemagne subjugated Croatia and these areas. The next year, Charlemagne finished subjugating the Saxons, so he could finally tick that off. In 799, he did the same to the Bretons, thus making the map nicer to look at, and he also conquered Barcelona. Thus, on the cusp of the year 800, the kingdom looked like this, and it's no wonder that it's sometimes referred to as the Carolingian Empire. Running this massive kingdom required ever more complex and capable methods of administration. The running of the kingdom revolved around the royal court, which regularly moved around the empire to various royal palaces, the most notable being here at Aachen. Aachen was not, as is often believed, the capital of the kingdom, but was an extremely important city in terms of administration and religious reform, as well as being Charlemagne's favoured residence. The kingdom was divided into counties and missatica, which were administrative districts. They were often inspected by Charlemagne's emissaries, called the Missi Dominici, which is Latin for envoys of the Lord. The Lord in this case being Charlemagne and not, God. The missi were made up of 2 officials, one ecclesiastical, often a bishop, and one secular, often a count, who would make sure the king's authority remained intact and would report back on any potential issues. The church was extremely important to maintaining order and running the kingdom. Bishops and learned men of the church had very prestigious positions at court, and Charlemagne, who was a very pious man, took great interest in church reform. In order to push through reform, Charlemagne would issue capitularies, which were edicts enforcing changes to church practices. The most famous of these capitularies was the Admonitio Generalis, which basically dictated the rules for the everyday lives of Charlemagne's subjects and standardized church practices. It decreed that the Christian nature of the kingdom was immutable and that there was to be a kingdom-wide revival of learning, which we will get to in a minute. The year 800 saw the most famous event of Charlemagne's reign when he went to Rome after Pope Leo III had fled to him because some of his enemies had tried to blind him. Charlemagne went back to Rome with him to sort things out, which he did, and whilst he was there, Leo III crowned him Imperator Romanum, or the Roman Emperor. Charlemagne thus became the first emperor in the West since the fall of Rome over 3 centuries prior. This title didn't really do much except grant a bunch of prestige and wind up those in the still very much alive Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Empire, often called the Byzantine Empire, was at this point being run by a woman, Irene, who had fallen out with the papacy, and so instead of patching things up, they simply picked a new emperor. The big debate surrounding Charlemagne's coronation hinges on whether or not he was the first Holy Roman Emperor, or if it was Otto I in 962. Those living at the time saw no difference between the title bestowed on Charlemagne or Otto I, and the distinction exists in the mind of historians only, who like to categorize them. In fact, the title was seen as no different to the one bestowed on Augustus. So, as previously stated, Charlemagne wanted to ensure that learning was revived in his kingdom, and so he oversaw a period known as the Carolingian Renaissance. The reason for this, much like Charlemagne's conquests, were religious, since it was believed that you couldn't be a good Christian until you knew what a good Christian was. It was seen as the duty of rulers to oversee the salvation of their subjects' souls, and so the exercise of power had to be combined with greater knowledge, a concept known as correctio. From across Europe, he sponsored scholars to come to his court, such as Alcuin from Northumbria, Paul the Deacon from the old Lombard kingdom, and Einhard, a Frank. Einhard, who was close to Charlemagne, wrote the life of Charles the Great, which is one of the major sources about his reign. Schools were founded across the kingdom, the most notable being Metz, Soissons, and St. Gall, and greater emphasis was given to learning. The curriculum was standardized, literacy rates amongst the nobility improved, and a new means of writing was created, Carolingian minuscule. This would see the implementation of many grammatical conventions, such as introducing lowercase letters, question marks, and standardizing letter forms. All of this led to a massive increase in the number of texts produced and a strengthening of the church, whose literacy rate made it indispensable to leaders. Charlemagne undertook much of this learning himself, and there is a common belief that he was illiterate. He probably wasn't, but there isn't overwhelming evidence either way. He didn't learn Latin, which was an official administrative language, until his later life, though, and Einhard claimed that he could speak and read Greek, but the truth of that is less clear. So, now that Charlemagne was an emperor who'd reformed his empire and conquered most of his neighbours, there was only one thing left to do: conquer more neighbours. In 805, after some raiding, Charlemagne took his forces to the east and subjugated all of these people, notably the Bohemians. In the south, there was some more conflicts with the Muslims, and by 812, the Franks had expanded to here. The only power in Europe that could challenge Charlemagne now was the Eastern Roman Empire, which held this territory, most notably Venice. In 812, Charlemagne won a diplomatic victory when the Byzantines recognized him as the legitimate emperor in the west, which might have had something to do with the fact that he had an army just outside of Venice. Whilst the size of the Frankish kingdom may have dissuaded aggression by the Byzantines, it didn't deter the Danes. Pretty much immediately after Francia's borders had expanded to reach Denmark's, raiding had begun up and down the coast. These raids were pretty devastating, but ultimately were nothing compared to what Charlemagne's successors would have to endure. Charlemagne's 47-year reign would come to an end when he died in 814. His eldest son, Pippin, had died in 811, and so he had only one legitimate son left, Louis, better known as Louis the Pious. His reign was somewhat less successful than his father's, though, and he ended up dividing the kingdom up between his sons, which led to the rise of 2 major states: in the west, the Kingdom of France, and in the east, the Holy Roman Empire. So Charlemagne is remembered as many things: a conqueror, a patron of scholars, as a reformer, and as a protector of the church. After his grandsons divided the empire between them, Charlemagne was considered the father figure of the new states which came out of it. Much of his reign was driven by his desire to be a great Christian king. He believed it was his duty to subjugate the surrounding areas and force conversions within them in order to save the souls of those who lived there. It is important to remember that much of his great legacy was built upon the work of his forebears Pippin and Charles Martel, without whom there may not have been a Francia at all. One thing is almost universally agreed upon, though: Charles most certainly deserved to be remembered as the Great. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and thank you for watching. There are some book recommendations.
So, when we speak about Charlemagne, we speak about a man who was extremely influential and powerful. Like the video explored, he was very, very well known for expanding the territory of this new empire. He was very well known for promoting literacy and education, specifically because he felt that it was God's purpose for people. It was God's plan for people to become educated and to become fluent. So because he was an advocate of the church and he promoted the church ideas, the church continued to expand. However, as you saw in the video, a lot of these conversions were forced conversions. So once again, one of our common themes throughout church history is that as the church becomes more secular, or as the church becomes more involved in politics, the quality of Christianity begins to dwindle, or the quality of Christianity begins to get a little distorted. So as Charlemagne is requiring people to become Christian and promoting Christianity, it's not very healthy for the church. And we're going to see in these next few slides how the church becomes a little, the lines between church and state become a little blurred. So the church becomes more of a political institute than it does an institute for souls and salvation. So that was briefly just a quick outline of what is happening in Europe during this time period. As I spoke to you in the first lecture that we had, this Western civilization and how Christianity develops from here. So I want to keep us focused on what's happening outside, because everything that happens in the political realm or in the economic world is affecting the church, or affects the church. So in this particular case, we see that the Pope anoints or crowns Charlemagne, which, as the video said, it didn't really mean anything, but for all of those Christians, it was an official calling or an official vocation for that specific ruler. So once again, these were the territories before Charlemagne. Charlemagne will eventually cover all of these different colors, and even getting into the gray areas where the Slavic tribes are. This is in 476. Charlemagne dies in 814, so roughly 400 years later, like 300 and something. So I want us to focus on what's happening in the church during this time period. We're going to cover briefly before Charlemagne's power, before he becomes leader of the Western world, but we're going to discuss the development of the church and specifically the papal power. So in 590, the church gets one of the most powerful figures of the time period. The Pope was Gregory the First. So Gregory the First comes in power in 590, and he begins this idea where their names are going to change for the official title of the Pope. So if you notice now, ever since then, the Popes had like a different name that's not actually their birth name, and it begins with Gregory the First. He's often regarded as Gregory the Great because his policies within the church cause a huge expansion, but it also, once again, he blurs this line between the state and the church. So when Gregory becomes Pope, or he obtains power as the Pope, his first act is to send missionaries throughout England and throughout the known world. He wants to Christianize all of these people. So as a Pope, he's very gospel-centered, Nowadays, we have these diverse opinions of the Pope, and some people would say that the current Pope is disconnected, but the earlier popes were still very well into the health of the churches. They were still well connected into seeing the development of the church. So in this particular case, Gregory begins to send missionaries throughout England, throughout the world, so that people would become Christian. He manages to expand the gospel by working with nations. He works with leaders. Keep in mind, these are the barbaric tribes. He's working with leaders, rulers, princes, to convert those people who were still heathen. So his rulers or his edicts are primarily focused on converting people. And the next thing that he does is that he's influencing and creating a lot of power in the local area that he's living in. So at the time Gregory was in Rome, right? He was the head of the Roman Church. He's officially made Rome a Christian city, or he's officially made Rome a Catholic city. So he literally has complete control of the governing body of Rome. He literally has control. Some of the religious figures that worked under him, some of the clergymen, were the official military or guard or the police force for the church and for Rome. So Rome becomes the first official city under papal power, or under the power of the Pope. When I refer to papal power, I refer to the Pope. And these ideas will eventually expand under Gregory the Hildebrand. But you can see already how the first Gregory the First, how his influence begins to distort these lines between what is a religious faith and a city-controlled religion. So as he begins to take over the city of Rome, and Rome becomes under the influence of the church, it's going to be very similar patterns that develop in cities elsewhere. He understood that under Gregory the First, certain theologies or practices begin to develop. So under his reign, they developed the idea of adoration of images, or iconism. And those are patterns that we still see today, where people have certain saints painted, or they have certain statues of certain saints, Mary, the apostles, and some of the other saints. So that begins to develop under the reign of Gregory, or under the rule of Gregory. The next thing that develops under his reign is purgatory. And I'm not going to go in too much detail about these. I think they're common terms that you guys may have heard of. But purgatory essentially is where the body goes after it dies, and it's like a waiting place where they're waiting to be judged by God. So that idea comes, and then the last one is the last theology or doctrine that establishes under Gregory is transubstantiation. Essentially what that is the idea that when you take communion, the bread and the wine literally become the body of Christ as you're eating it. So, and I'll share with you guys a good example of that, because we all just carry these in our backpack, right? So they believe that as you're eating the wafer, it literally becomes Christ's body. It's, as Pentecostal, specifically Assemblies of God, we believe that this is more of a symbol than it is an actual conversion. But Gregory the First introduces this idea that the wine that you drink, or the grape juice, whatever you decide to use, it literally converts into the blood of Christ as you're taking it. So, which is why there was already certain ideas like that, which is why, we talked about in previous history, where they believed that Christians were cannibals, because they literally thought they were eating bread, or they were eating bodies and actually drinking blood. So the idea was already there, but Gregory kind of makes it this doctrine known as transubstantiation, where this literally converts into the body of Christ. So Gregory is very influential in as a leader, not only in the religious realm, but as a political figure. Once again, the influences that they have now is very impactful. They're working side by side with political leaders. They're working side by side with nations. And the idea, of course, is to convert people. Most of these leaders were okay with Christianity. There's no more persecution, as was already done for over 400 years. No, sorry, over 300 years. Uh, Persecution has already ended. So now what they're doing is now they're using this peace that they've gotten under the reign of the edict of Constantine. They're using that influence to be able to convert people at a larger scale. So they believe that if they can work by side with mainstream politicians or mainstream leaders, princes and kings, that they would be able to expand Christianity as a whole. So as a result of that, the church begins to grow. And there's three things that I want us to focus on today in regards to that. The first is political cohesiveness. Once again, the church was working alongside political leaders. The church, because it had its guards, because it had its well organized group of like police force, they had the church was still doing a lot of community service. The church was still doing a lot in regards to helping people. Because of that, they were able to work side by side with the politicians of the time. And rulers saw it as a benefit to the country. People are more submissive. People are more obedient. Whether they're genuine Christians or not, people were still following some of the rules of the church, which always, as we know, as we as believers know that, although we have faults and stuff, we try to follow the rules that are here on earth, or we try to obey as much as possible. So there's this line once again begins to become blurred, but in its start, it was still just them working side by side. The church was benefiting from having that political protection, and at the same time, the political rulers were benefiting from the church participating in events or participating in helping its community and those people that were being ministered by it. At the same time, when we speak about political cohesiveness, the religious leaders kept the church, the religious leaders kept politicians in check. So we're going to hear about some stories where the popes excommunicate certain kings because they were divorcing or because they were doing a lot of unethical behaviors in a personal scale, but that affected the nation as a whole. So it's kind of like, and it's a weird way I'm going to put it, in our government in the United States, we have a checks and balance system, right? We have the three stages: the judicial, the legislative, and the executive branch. Think about it this way. Although the church wasn't a legal institution, it was a religious institution, it still helps keep the political leaders in check, and it still helped organize them so that when they were immoral or when they participated in things that were unethical, the church responded to it first. The second thing that I want us to explore in the reasons for the church to grow. So the church grew. When I mentioned political cohesiveness, I want us to not only focus on the growth as a political organization or a political institution, but I also want us to realize that this is allowing the church to grow in numbers. So as the church is helping the nation develop itself, as the church is helping these territories, they're getting members out of this. The people are being converted, and they're encouraging conversion to Christianity. So like we saw in the video, Charlemagne was a strong promulgator, a strong advocate for conversion to Christianity. So that's happening already from the early 400s, and more particular during the reign of, or during the papal, the office of Pope Gregory. I don't know whether I call it a reign. Do I call it a term? Because they're not really elected, but at that time. So I don't know. But you guys get it. During his time in office, I don't know. So we see the next thing is political inconsistencies. One of the things that attracts people to the church is this idea of hope that it presents. We see it in the book of Acts where they have the fellowship among the believers. And we see this throughout, that as countries get shaken, when Rome was at its downfall, the church grew. And the reason is because people want to go to an institution that they can trust, or people want to go to a body that can help them. So not only is the political cohesiveness helping the church, but also the fact that at this point they're not unified yet. It's just a whole bunch of barbaric tribes. They're just a whole bunch of different rulers. So because there was no uniform government, there was no steady governments, nations were at war with each other, Europe was in complete and utter chaos, they found refuge in the church. The church provided relief. The church provided reform, the church provided a sense of comfort for the people. So while they were working alongside these political forces, at the same time they knew the weaknesses of these political forces, and they were able to address that during their time period. And that's something that I want us to keep in mind, because as we mentioned prior, one of the things that we want to get out of church history is common things that are happening around us in political times. There's a lot of chaos, whatever your legal or political beliefs are, right? The church should be able to address some of these needs. You know, the church should address the issue of people who don't have resources. The church should address people who don't have the same opportunities, right? And in this case, we don't see that the political leaders are leading reform. It's the church that's leading reform. So that was a benefit that the church had, and it contributed to its growth, both in legal power and in numbers. So once again, these 3 points are not only talking about the legal power that they're getting, because now people will look at the church as if it was this bigger support than the government, but it's also encouraging people to convert to Christianity. The last thing that I want us to focus on for reasons of growth is the church was steady. So although politics and the nations were not organized well, the church was very organized. Remember the video that we saw last week, these stages of hierarchy that develop within the church. So now whenever there's confusion or there's doubt, they know who to come to, and they're getting quick responses. Although the means of communication weren't as advanced as they will be in the Reformation era or in modern day times, the way that these areas are split, as you saw in the video, there was different territories that were assigned. So the church was able to communicate more accessibly to those people. It's not perfect, and we're going to see why it's not perfect. It actually, communication leads to a split between the Eastern Church and the Western Church, but it helps in the fact that it contributed to the growth, and it kept the church functioning. So as a result of the councils that we've talked about, we will discuss a few more. The church was comfortable with doctrine. They had something established. Now that there was a pope, now that they had somebody in charge, they had like this president or this key figure, he was able to continuously present an organized doctrine to the church. So the councils were still the overall arch. The councils were still the overall source of doctrine. They would still meet up. The bishops would still gather. But if there was something that needed to be addressed immediately, the pope was able to do that now. Most bishops supported the church. They were very, very well organized. So that led to a lot of bishops helping one another out. They were behind all of the changes that were happening theologically. They were behind all of the doctrinal changes. So that's always healthy. When the church can agree on major issues, it leads not only to the growth of an institution, more churches are established, the vision is set across, but now it's also leading to more conversions, because people who are coming or converting from these faiths, specifically pagans or these Germanic paganism, they're seeing how the church is organized and united. And then lastly, this church was, as I mentioned, we're going to talk briefly about monasticism. Monks and nuns were working alongside priests and bishops. So it wasn't just the fact that you had this hierarchy, but now the hierarchy is divided into several different limbs, and different people are working in different functions that were not necessarily being addressed during the time period. So throughout history, we find that the church gets confronted with certain social paradigms. In the case of the apostles, they're questioned why they're not taking care of the nuns or why they're not taking care of the widows. And throughout history, we've seen that people are complaining about why the church isn't doing something. So in this case, they have nuns, they have monks who are working alongside these priests, these bishops, and once again, they have political allies. So the church is well protected. The church is well established. And because the church had already presented itself so well over the course of the last few years, and religious or political leaders were promoting it and talking about its goodness, it allowed the church to develop itself and allowed people to see the church in a good light. So those are the three primary reasons of why the church grew. Once again, the political cohesiveness, it was working alongside its political allies. The second thing was political inconsistencies. The nations were weak. They were very chaotic. They didn't have organized. They were literally switching from ruler to ruler to ruler in the matter of months and years. And then lastly, the church was offering what the political system could not. So there's three separate spheres that I want us to look at, and I should have drawn a Venn diagram. You have the church, you have politics, and in between you have where they cross over, where the church works alongside political spheres. We good? Awesome. So I have a video to show you guys. Once again, I told you we're going to watch various videos. We'll watch the video. This one is going to explain briefly. I don't remember which video this is. Okay, this is going to explain the donation of Constantine, which I didn't mention. Why didn't I mention that? Oh, okay. Before we watch the video, let me explain a little bit about the donation of Constantine, and then we'll watch the video. So, as all of these things are going on, the church is expanding, the political power of the church is expanding, and eventually a certain document known as the donation of Constantine arises. It was a fraudulent document. It was a forged document, and what it said was that when Constantine before Constantine died, he issued an edict or a ruling that territory was going to be given to the church, and that the power of the church was greater. So the church was autonomous, the church was self-governing, and the church had certain rights that weren't going to be able to be taken away. And because people believed that these articles were correct, the church was literally given power, political power. The church was given political land. And we're going to watch the video explains briefly what this political power is that I'm talking about. And it's also going to explore a little bit of the benefits that this fake article did. So somebody forged Constantine's writings. We're going to explain how we know that they're fake, and how this benefited the church.
One of the most famous forged documents in history, the Donation of Constantine, was allegedly written in the 4th century. The document granted the authority of Emperor Constantine's Western Roman Empire to the papacy. The document was constantly under scrutiny and rumored as a forgery, yet it wasn't until the 15th century that the document would be disproven by Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla. Every time the church needed to take land, invade a religious city, or otherwise take political control throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, this was a document they pointed to in order to justify those actions. Starting out in the 4th century, Constantine the Great became the first Christian Roman emperor. During his lifetime, Constantine showed to be a strong proponent of Christianity and was the first central figure to unite Christendom under one banner. This made it reasonable to believe that the Donation of Constantine was created in Constantine's time. But when was it actually created? What were the motives? And how did it change medieval European politics? In the 8th century, Pope Stephen II had booted the Lombards from the Italian peninsula with the help of the Carolingian king and Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short. Pepin took the lands he had conquered and handed them over to the church in what would become known as the Donation of Pepin. Some historians now believe that Stephen II had the Donation of Constantine written to legitimize the claim to the land Pepin had just conquered by essentially saying,
Emperor Constantine said we can take over this land sometime back. Here's a document that that Constantine wrote to prove it.
When the church established the papal states soon after, nobody could really question it, and the church was finally on the literal map. This, however, was only the beginning. Jumping to the 11th century, the church underwent ecclesiastical change known as the Gregorian Reform. In 1075, the church sought to end the practice of appointing bishops and condemned outside influences of notable secular figures. The popes finally received the recognition demanded by the Donation of Constantine as heads of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that stretched across Europe, and this led to arguably one of the most important historical events in medieval Europe, the
I can't hear it. Can anybody hear it?
I can't either.
Manuelito! Hey, Manuelito! My brother, where you at? Manuel de la Torre. Hey, Manuel de la Torre. I'm gonna see if I
Yeah.
can text him.
Hello?
Oh, yeah, we can't hear it, bro.
Oh, did it cut off?
Yeah, something.
Oh, I'm
We just
sorry.
can't hear it though.
Let me
No,
replay
you
it.
good, you good.
Where'd you guys leave off? Right here?
Go for it.
Where did the audio cut
Por
off?
ahí, por ahí.
All right.
That's
We
good
can-
right there, I think.
You guys
Yeah.
want to rewatch it? It's only like 4 minutes.
Dele, dele, yeah.
All right, I'll just play it from here. Or yeah, let's just oops. All right, we'll just rewatch it. Okay. Sorry guys. Can you hear now?
One of the most famous forged documents in history, the donation of Constantine was
Yeah.
originally written in
Just tell the guy he needs to be more.
document granted the
Más-
authority of
más
Emperor
ganas.
Constantine's Western
I feel like
Roman
that's how I'm
Empire
teaching
to the
today, so I
papacy.
have to shortly play
The
it like I'm
document was
teaching.
constantly under scrutiny and rumored as a forgery. Yet, it wasn't until the 15th century that the document would be disproven by Italian humanist Lorenzo Valla. Every time the church needed to take land, invade a religious city, or otherwise take political control throughout Europe during the Middle Ages, this was a document they pointed to in order to justify those actions. Starting out in the 4th century, Constantine the Great became the first Christian Roman emperor. During his lifetime, Constantine showed to be a strong proponent of Christianity and was the first central figure to unite Christendom under one banner. This made it reasonable to believe that the donation of Constantine was created in Constantine's time. But when was it actually created? What were the motives? And how did it change medieval European politics? In the 8th century, Pope Stephen II had booted the Lombards from the Italian peninsula with the help of the Carolingian king and Charlemagne's father, Pepin the Short. Pepin took the lands he had conquered and handed them over to the church in what would become known as the donation of Pepin. Some historians now believe that Stephen II had the donation of Constantine written to legitimize the claim to the land Pepin had just conquered by essentially saying,
Emperor Constantine said we can take over this land sometime back. Here's a document that that Constantine wrote to prove it.
when the church established the papal states soon after, nobody could really question it, and the church was finally on the literal map. This, however, was only the beginning. Jumping to the 11th century, the church underwent ecclesiastical change known as the Gregorian Reform. In 1075, the church sought to end the practice of appointing bishops and condemned outside influences of notable secular figures. The popes finally received the recognition demanded by the donation of Constantine as heads of an ecclesiastical hierarchy that stretched across Europe, and this led to arguably one of the most important historical events in medieval Europe, the Crusades. With the Byzantine Empire under attack in the late 11th century, the Byzantine emperor did not write to a secular king for help, but to Pope Urban II. Pope Urban II received the call and had the difficult task of fixing a fragmented Europe of Christian kingdoms constantly at war with one another. The papacy called upon Christians to take up the cross, and Europe answered with kings, nobles, and warriors from all over uniting under one banner. Overall, these crusades were a shining example of the church's importance in deciding the fate of Europe, as written in the donation of Constantine. While the donation of Constantine did not directly cause the Crusades, the forgery set the stage for the church to gain enough influence to mobilize all warring Christians throughout Europe, effectively turning their swords away from one another and towards Jerusalem. By the time the humanist intellectual Lorenzo Valla finally managed to disprove the document in the 15th century, the church had already established itself as one of the most influential powers in European society. With Christians from all over Europe, their power expanded across kingdoms. Overall, the donation of Constantine had served its purpose in establishing the church's power beyond solely religion, and allowed the church to be a major player in European affairs during the medieval period.
Okay. So we understood how we understood how the donation of Constantine gave power to these leaders, specifically the church leaders, as they begin to expand. So how do we know that the donation? Any questions regarding the donation of Constantine? I'm going to explore a little bit of how we know that they were fraudulent. I think
Pastor Emanuel,
Monday.
disculpe, solo quiero, no sé, hacer un aporte o un comentario acerca de lo que hemos visto hasta ahorita con respecto a lo que he leído. Lo que usted está explicando, pues no lo entiendo mucho, pero sí he leído el libro y sé de lo que más o menos creo saber de lo que está hablando. Veo la importancia que tuvo esa lucha de poderes entre la iglesia y la política, pues propiamente por eso, por el poder.
Sí.
Y lo que hicieron con lo que supuestamente había dicho Constantino, que verdaderamente era una falsedad de todo lo que se veía. Y la lucha por el poder era evidente. O sea, lo que los papas querían era tener un dominio propio, pero obviamente los reyes tampoco se iban a querer dejar sacar de esa manera. Luis XIV en Francia dijo: el Estado soy yo, cuando ya vio lo que se le avecinaba, cuando empezó a ver toda esa bola grande de poder que estaba agarrando a la iglesia. Y segundo punto que he visto, la verdad no sé si lo he explicado, pero yo lo estaba mirando también, que a este periodo que estamos estudiando precisamente, el del 476 hasta 1453, históricamente se le conoció como el del oscurantismo, ¿ya? Que donde hacía referencia el oscurantismo a la abolición o supresión de cualquier pensamiento o ideología distinta a lo que pensaran los altos jerarcas de la iglesia, porque todo lo que fuera contrario a ellos era declarado como herejía. Entonces, ahí se ve que el poder querían ellos llevarlo de una sola manera. Y como tercero, pues, no sabremos decirlo si son las cosas de Dios o esto tendría que pasar, o como pasó de esta manera. El libro que estamos leyendo pareciera, en esta parte, pareciera ser de la Iglesia Católica, pero exactamente ellos fueron como que los que se dieron la lucha, y más adelante pues se sabe pues todas las ramificaciones que salieron, pues con tantas personas que ya no quisieron, se dieron cuenta de que esa no era la línea correcta hacia las cosas con Dios, y pues de ahí surgieron muchas ramas de las iglesias. Eso quería decir, Pastor Emanuel.
Gracias. Brother is just making a quick observation about the power struggles that developed through the donation of Constantine between the church and the state, and how they're both fighting now for obtaining territories. And in particular, he refers to how the papal powers are becoming more aggressive in order to obtain more political roles or more political power and such. So that's a great observation. Anybody else have any comments regarding this? Okay, so after a while, people realized that the donation of Constantine. Oh, go ahead.
I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry. It's not that more of a question, but more of a, about the power struggle here, or the power of what they were trying to have. I'm sorry, I might be a little bit airheaded about this, but this is the part, because I like to relate stuff in movies and stuff, with the Three Musketeers, and during that time where the Cardinals had all that power and were able to even, kind of be able to throw off kings and stuff like that.
I'm gonna sound really weird, but I've never seen the Three Musketeers. So I don't know how to answer that. I need to look it up really quick.
No, it's just that how the Cardinals were so much in power. you know, that they even seem more powerful than the kings. And as they were talking about here, the kings here, they knew that,
Yeah.
correct?
So
And that's why they weren't able to get confused with the Constantine letter.
correct. That is absolutely correct. The Three Musketeers is set 200 years after the dates that we're talking about, but those are themes that begin to develop in the era that we're talking about. So you're absolutely correct on that. Cool.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Just making sure. Okay, great.
Yeah, and right now we see more in particular that it's the Pope who's abusing, or not abusing his powers, but overstretching his powers. But those are going to be common traits. Once they see that the head of the church is doing it, then other people are going to begin to develop the same mindset. Keep in mind, they're unified right now. They're united, so they're just following that chain of command. All right, so let's explore briefly how we know that these articles are fake. First things first is there was a different type of Latin being used in the earlier centuries where when Constantine was in charge or in power, and the I don't know, why do I keep stuttering today? The donation of Constantine was written in 9th century Latin. So this is roughly 7 centuries that have passed by in language, and it's changed a lot over time. I mean, we think about the changes that have happened since we've been alive, right? There's so many new terms out there. Yesterday, I just learned new slang, and I was like, whoa, I never knew that word. So just imagine how much the language has changed in 7 centuries. So as historians read this, and as people who are church or in political fields are reading this, they're realizing that it's a completely different Latin. Second thing was the historical context that was given was different. So they were describing certain events in history that hadn't happened during the times of Constantine. They were more modern events or more recent events to the standards of the people during the abuse of the donation of Constantine. The third thing is that the donation of Constantine included quotes that were from the Vulgate, and as we studied, the Vulgate was translated in the 400s. So Constantine was no longer in rule or in power when the Vulgate was written or translated. So there was quotes from the Vulgate that were being used, and it was long after that. And then lastly, the donation of Constantine was written from somebody in the 400s. Like one of the people that it was being written from was in the 400s, and he's writing to somebody in the 200s. So somebody in the 5th century writing to somebody in the 3rd century. It's kind of as if Queen Elizabeth was writing to George Washington, or if I was writing to George Washington, right? Why am I writing to somebody who's no longer alive? So there's a lot of inconsistencies in the donation of Constantine, which permitted people to realize that it was fraudulent or not real. The church didn't always grow. Political realms didn't always grow. There was a lot of weak popes. There was weak princes that didn't work alongside the church. And there was a lot of corruption. As you can see now, in this particular case, people were forging papers in order to gain power. And as the popes and the church begins to obtain more power, as you heard the quote, absolute power corrupts absolutely. So as the church begins to obtain more power, they begin to become more perverted. Keep in mind that many of these religious leaders were trying to impose Christianity on other people, and if their tactics didn't work, they would become more aggressive. At the same time, a lot of people are forcibly being converted. So because they're forcibly being converted, it's not a genuine act of faith or a genuine declaration of faith. So you begin to get a lot of Christians in title again, just like we had seen when Rome became Christian. You get a lot of Christians in title, but not in behavior or in practice. Between 1073 and 1216, the church had their power throughout all of Europe. So in the course of 200 years, the church has already expanded all of its influence and its territory throughout Europe. So any questions on the growth of the church? Any questions on the donation of Constantine? All right, if we're all good, let's continue moving forward. We get our next Gregory, and he rules the church behind the throne until 1085. I have the dates here somewhere. Somewhere on my notes. Give me a second. My device is acting up. He was Pope from April 1073 to 1085. So he rules, or he's Pope for about 12 years. 1073 to 1085. And Gregory leads the church, Gregory of Hildenbrand, however you want to call him, he leads the church in a great reformation. So like Gregory the First, Gregory leads the Hildenbrand leads the church in a large reformation of the clerical system. And this is what happens. He gets rid of offices that were being purchased. So during that time period when somebody wanted a religious power or religious role, or somebody wanted a political power or political role, they would purchase their positions. That sounds awesome. I want to be a pastor, so let me pay $300 a month. I can become the pastor. And that's what they were doing. They were buying roles, and he completely gets rid of that. He sets standards. He sets a requirement in order for somebody to become a religious figure or somebody to become a minister within the church. And he also encourages, he doesn't officially require it, but he encourages for people to become celibate. So he encourages the males to not get married and to abstain from sex. So that doesn't become a ruling until later on within the Universal Church or the Catholic Church. We can now call it the Roman Catholic Church. That doesn't become an official decree until later, but Gregory is the first to encourage that movement. So he leads a great reformation. He's trying to purge the church of its corruption. He's trying to purge the church of all of these bad leaders who were doing it for more of a political role or for more of an influential role. Keep in mind that the church was benefiting politically, which not only meant finances or power, but it was also benefiting from the mass amount of people that were converting. So there was people who were trying to abuse the role of the church. When it comes to the separation of church and state, Gregory was actually very opposed, very opposite to that of Gregory the First, where he begins to get rid of stuff that the nations had imposed. So he gets rid of the nomination of popes and bishops by the state. So it was kind of like they were elected by political figures. So he separates it completely. The church offices were going to be ran individually. Does that make sense? So it was no longer that the politicians or the political leaders were going to endorse or put somebody in a position, but now the church was going to do it on its own. And then, so that was for the popes and the bishops. And then he also gets rid of church-sponsored courts. So whenever there was a legal hearing or legal proceeding, they would have the church or the local bishop in charge of that court case. He formally ends that, and now the church is responsible, or the state is now responsible for their own court hearings. So he not only reforms the perversion of the church or some of the corruption of the church, but he is also separating the influence that the state has on the church. And we think that he's doing it to help the church, but he's really doing it, the motives are to empower the church even more. The less control that the state has over the church, the more that the church can have control over the state. So that's the intention behind Gregory. And the last thing is that the church becomes powerful. The church becomes extremely powerful under Gregory the Seventh. And this is what begins to happen, is that the Hildebrand, or Gregory the Seventh, however you want to refer to him as, he was elected Pope in 1073. There it is in my notes. Wow. And he takes the name. He becomes known as a strong reformer. And one of those projects includes the power of the Pope and the power of political primacy. So in one situation, there's this ruler, his name is Henry the Fourth, and Henry the Fourth and the Holy Roman Empire are relatively weak. In the middle of one of these rebellions, the Saxon Rebellion, Henry needs support of the church. So he agrees to submit himself to the authority of Gregory the Seventh. The official ruler of this tribe, or of this empire, the Holy Roman Empire, agrees to be under the authority of the Pope. We can see where this is going to go wrong. And as he does this, Henry gets a little upset with one of Gregory's decisions. So he tries to cut ties with members of the council. Eventually that leads the rebellion is put down. And as this happens, Henry no longer wants to be under the submission of Gregory. He tries to reassert his authority as the ruler, and he sets up a government in northern Italy. So as he sets up this government, Gregory is not happy. Gregory had all the power, all the judicial power, he had all the political power, he had all the religious power. So Gregory is unhappy, and he sends Henry a letter, and Henry tears this letter apart. This letter, he received it in December of 1075. And Gregory, essentially what this letter says is that Henry broke all of the promises, and that Henry was on grounds of excommunication, which was, as we know, one of the most serious punishments. Henry doesn't care, and he sets up a council. This is known as the Council, or the Synod of Worms. And it's called the Council of Worms, not because they were worms, but because that's the name of the city, the Council of Worms. And as he's there, Henry is able to gather a list of cardinals that were very influential. They didn't like Gregory's reforms. They didn't like the fact that the Pope was the ruler of this nation. And in the middle of this council, Gregory excommunicates King Henry. He excommunicates him and removes the title of emperor from him. So now the Pope was both emperor and the Pope of the church, since he had all the power. Fortunately for Gregory, he had a more influence than Henry. Henry did not have very much influence. Henry was not very popular among the princes. And Gregory's main concern was not to discredit the empire, but he wanted a higher spiritual government. And this is important. This is what leads to the development of the papal powers, is that Gregory didn't want to take away the power from Henry. Gregory wanted to show that the church was more predominant. So Gregory Hildebert VII officially becomes Pope and the ruler of the Roman Catholic Church and the ruler of the Holy Roman Empire, because he discredits the power of Henry IV. So we can see the major shift of power. Now the church that was once persecuted is now the church that's leading the Western Europe and society in Western Europe. So we're gonna take a pause here. Come back at 8:45. We'll take a 15-minute break. If you have any questions, just write them down, and we'll get back to speaking a little bit about Gregory and the development of the church when we come back. So I stopped at a great time. So see you guys in 15 minutes. Are we all here? Cool. I see people showing up now. We left off talking about Gregory's effect on the church up till 1085, from 1073 to 1085. Now we're going to explore. Let me pop this open for you guys to see. Okay, cool. So throughout the class today, we've discussed briefly on Charlemagne's power and his effect on the Roman, or his effect on European society. We've discussed the increase in papal power and how some of the popes became more effective. We looked at two in particular, Gregory the First and Gregory the Seventh. Then we discussed about the expansion of the church and how the church was developing over time, and its influence in politics and its influence in society. We've taken a look at the donation of Constantine, how it was a fraudulent article created to further empower the papal states and to further empower those leaders who were in religious authority. And now I want us to take a look at briefly the Great Schism and how the Eastern Church divides from the Western Church. So before we start talking, or before I show you the video on that, I want us to remember that the Eastern Church and the Western Church were battling often or having conflicts, first of all, because one of the churches, and this was in our last like two lectures ago, where the church in the West, the church that was in Rome, wanted to continue to have the Pope there, or their religious figures there. They wanted it to be the home of the church, whereas the church in the East said, well, now that our capital is in Constantinople, this is where all official decrees should come from. So that began to split. Keep in mind that the heresies, as they begin to rise, they arose more in one church than the other. So that continued to further expand divisions within this church. By the time of the Great Schism, which is roughly 1054, the Great Schism, we're going to watch a video about that briefly, but by the time that happens, the church is already fractured severely enough where we get the rise of the Orthodox Church. So if you remember the first map or the first diagram that I showed you, let's see if I can bring that up. So many slides ago. If you remember in the earlier slide, we see the unchanged church, 1054 with the yellow dots. That's what we refer to as the Great Schism or the Great Division. And that's what officially separates the Roman Church and the Orthodox Church. So there is a lot of doctrinal differences, but the results of it really comes from what the video is going to explain briefly. So one of the things that I forgot to mention before class, or in the beginning of class, was that we're looking at these events in a larger scale as opposed to looking at them through a timeline. So we're looking at between before 476 to 1453. Instead of looking at them as like a timeline, we're looking at them by large movements. Just because once again, the era is covering so much information. So if I go event by event, it's going to be a little bit more boresome for you guys, and we're going to cover a lot of things that aren't necessary to church history. Whereas if we cover these larger ideas, even though I've tried my best to organize them in a timeline, but I rather look at the larger ideas so that we can understand how that's affecting the church. So both these books, the story of the Christian church and church history in plain language, have it as far timelined as possible, but they cover a lot of other stuff that isn't essential or necessary for us to understand what the main ideas are. So I've just pinpointed the great ideas, and even then some. I don't think this book does justice to explaining the Great Schism or the Great Divide. It literally tells you in the first chapter of the medieval church, it says, we're going to focus primarily on the Western church instead of the Eastern church. So that's a little unfortunate. But I think it's important because it is part of church history, and it's one of the largest of the first divisions of the church. So I'm going to stop talking for a bit. I know you guys are tired of my voice. Let's watch the video. Okay, before we watch the video, actually, this is a great diagram that explores how the church splits. As you can see, it literally splits between East and West. In some cases, there are overlapping boundaries, such as where it says the Kingdom of Hungary or Hungary. You're going to see that part of their influence is still in that area just because it was one of those border countries. So you have people who follow both churches, or one group that follows the Catholic Church and another group that follows the Orthodox Church. However, you can see the physical separations of these two. So they were not only divided because of doctrinal beliefs. They were not only divided because of papal powers, but there was also a division because there were two different cultures. As accurate as much as we want to blame it on the church and its politics, a lot of it had to do with just the diversity of cultures and the developments that happened. Unfortunately, a lot of doctrine comes from culture, and they're not necessarily biblical truths, and that develops there. I'll use a great example, and this doesn't necessarily reflect my beliefs, but the drinking of wine or the drinking of alcohol in some countries is completely forbidden, and in other countries it's not. Within the United States, the Assemblies of God ministers is not to allow to have wine because of just or any alcohol because of our background and just the history of the United States and the development of it. But in other countries, they are. So that's just a common example. But you can see how small things like that, especially in the earlier stages of a church's development, will cause a big impact. Now, it wasn't something small like that. There was a lot of bigger issues, and we're going to see how culture plays a role in society and how culture plays a role in the church.
In July of
Can you
1054,
hear the video? You guys are able to hear that? Okay, let me go back.
Yeah, wait, but I have like a sort of off-topic question.
Yeah.
It's like sort of it's been like on my mind for like 2 days, like 2 days now. Would John and Peter be like classified or like known as like prominent church leaders?
Yeah. Definitely.
They would? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, yeah, I was just thinking of that. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
In July of 1054, after an unfortunate fight between the Patriarch of Constantinople and a delegate of the Pope, the leaders of the Eastern and Western churches mutually excommunicated one another. For many, this event marks the definitive cause of the Great Schism, the moment when the two churches permanently fell out of communion with one another. But is it really that simple? While undoubtedly the most dramatic event of the relationship, history reveals that it was neither the beginning nor the end of the story of schism between East and West. This is Catholicism in Focus. Even though the Eastern and Western churches did not declare an official state of schism until 1054, disharmony and conflict had been present for centuries, stemming from a wide variety of issues. The earliest and most obvious cause of conflict came down to culture. Essentially split between two nations, the churches had different social structures, were influenced by different philosophies, and most importantly, they spoke different languages. Imagine trying to determine precise and orthodox teachings about how God can be one yet three, eternal yet died on the cross, and then imagine trying to do that in another language. Besides the fact that this added difficulty led to less enthusiasm to work together, and the fact that great distance and danger of travel at times made it impossible to meet on a regular basis, there were numerous cases in which mistranslation caused major tension between the two. Take the issue of icons, discussed at the Second Council of Nicaea in 787. Officially promulgated in Greek, the council declared that venerating icons was permitted and not considered idolatry because the image was a vehicle for worship, not the object of worship itself. Unfortunately, when this was taken back to the West and translated for Charlemagne's court, the word venerate was translated as adore, an obvious heresy. In turn, Charlemagne called a local council in Frankfurt in 794 to condemn the teachings of Nicaea, angering the East. Beyond strictly cultural issues, there were also issues of theology that caused a strife between the churches. One such issue was the role of clerical celibacy. Although its strict enforcement wasn't universalized in the West until centuries later, there has always been an emphasis placed on it, something that the East never imposed and did not agree with. There were also differences when it came to defining and emphasizing the nature of the Trinity, the use of leavened or unleavened bread in worship, and varied rules when it came to fasting. But no matter how much culture, language, and theology created unrest, they were not enough to cause a schism on their own. No, what eventually pushed them over the edge is something that gets to us all: politics. Originally, the church had 5 major centers of religious authority where the most important bishops resided: Rome, Constantinople, Alexandria, Antioch, and Jerusalem. While it's stretched to say that they worked together as a democracy, there is definitely a sense that, at least in the beginning, there was a mutual respect and dependence on one another for leadership. Over the course of the first millennia, the political landscape of the Christian world changed tremendously, witnessing the fall of Rome, the rise of Islam, weakened nations, and constant war. As this political unrest continued, Rome became increasingly isolated from the other sees. While the remaining 4 still worked as collegial members of the authoritative body, the Bishop of Rome began to work more independently, and as he gained more civil power, began to see himself as the sole shepherd of not only the Western Church, but of all of Christendom. As a result, issues like the Filioque controversy began to arise. In the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed of 381, the line regarding the Holy Spirit reads, "I believe in the Holy Spirit, the Lord, the giver of life, who proceeds from the Father." If this seems incomplete to Catholics today, that's because the words "and the Son," or Filioque in Latin, were added in the 6th century to combat heretics and to clarify the West's interpretation. And while it might seem like a strictly theological issue without practical importance, don't be fooled. At its core, this was an issue of political and ecclesial authority. The East, coming from a collegial and apostolic perspective, could not accept the Pope's authority over an ecumenical council. The West, coming from a more hierarchical and Christological perspective, saw it as the rightful place of the Pope to make such decisions. 2 centuries later, another controversy arose over this question of jurisdiction. In 858, Emperor Michael III deposed the Patriarch of Constantinople and replaced him with a more favorable leader. Pope Nicholas, believing himself to be the shepherd of the whole flock, investigated the events, summoned the council, and concluded that this was an inappropriate decision. Going over the emperor's authority, he deposed the new patriarch and reinstated the old one. But wait, it gets worse. When Nicholas was questioned by Michael, he essentially responded that kings need popes, but popes don't need kings. Ooh, buddy. Yeah, Nicholas was excommunicated by the East for that. But the church remained together. Even in 1009, when Pope Sergius IV sent a letter to the East that included the Filioque, and the East in turn removed the Pope from the official list of prayers, schism had not yet been reached. And yet, at the same time, the church remained largely divided, officially in communion, but unofficially fractured for centuries. Placed within the context of the wider contentious story, the events of 1054 might still jump out as dramatic and damaging to the relationship, but it's unfair to say that it would have been understood in its time as a permanent split. Because really, everything that's been mentioned up to this point is operating on a very high level: political authority, esoteric theological formulas, translations of official documents. The working man or woman did not give one iota about these matters. That was until 1098 and the First Crusade. You know how you try to do something nice to fix a problem, but end up doing something much worse? Yeah, that's sort of what happened. Extending an olive branch that had previously been withheld, Pope Urban sent troops to Constantinople to aid the East in defending its city. Unfortunately, instead of fighting for the East, the Western soldiers began fighting against the East for part of the reconquered lands, acted rude and greedy, and eventually drove the Greek patriarch into exile so they could install their own Latin one. Oops. For the first time, the conflict between East and West had been brought to the level of the people, and they wanted nothing of it. Language, culture, theology, and politics aside, they just hated each other on a gut level. More than any excommunication or power grab by a pope, what cemented division between the two churches was the unfortunate actions of greedy soldiers coming from the West, but not representing it well. Luckily, things have changed since then. In 1964, Pope Paul VI embraced Patriarch Athenagoras I on the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem, a symbolic gesture of peace that established a tradition honored by their successors. The following year, the North American Orthodox Catholic Theological Consultation began meeting, and has been meeting semi-annually since. In 2003, they even reached the conclusion and recommended to their prospective bishops that the filioque was no longer a church-dividing issue. And most recently, being that he's a very collegially minded pope, Pope Francis has made tremendous strides towards reunification, explicitly stating in 2014 that he's seeking communion with the Orthodox churches. And maybe that's where we're headed. The point I think to remember in all of this is that division did not happen overnight. Rather than just being over one moment of passion that resulted in mutual excommunications, the division between East and West developed over a long period of time and on a wide variety of issues. Unification, that's what we seek, is going to take a lot of time to develop as well. But if we truly believe that we are the body of Christ and we can agree on so much of what makes us Christian, that's one task we should be ready to take on. Thanks for watching this episode of Catholicism in Focus, made possible by Mary McNicholas and all the patrons on Patreon. Be sure to check out all the great content on breakingthehabit.org and follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter for more pictures, videos, and posts.
So there, in a nutshell, is the division of the West and East Church. Once again, as he mentions, the churches are still divided. They're working towards a unification again, or at least Pope Francis is. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops. The Catholic Church has gotten itself in a lot of messy situations over the few years, and we've seen a lot of them convert to Protestantism, so that's always been good. But yeah, so cultural, political, regional powers caused the division of the two churches, and it was the boiling point was when these two bishops excommunicated each other, and that just kind of triggered everything that had been happening throughout history. So he covers a lot of the stuff that we've been covering throughout these last few weeks. The thing about this class is that I feel like we've discussed enough points throughout the other classes that now we're seeing the effects of everything that we've already talked about. So you're seeing the effects we saw the effects of persecution. Now we saw the effects of the councils. We saw the effects of Constantine's rules. And now we're seeing the effects of small tensions that develop with the rising of these different perspectives or different groups of people. So we're going to talk about one more pope. This is Pope Innocent III. He rules between 1198 to 1216, so right after the schism, the Great Schism. I've been trying to put these larger picture ideas in between each pope. So I talked about the first pope, then I talked about the donation of Constantine, I talked about Pope Gregory VII, then I talked about the Great Schism. Now we're going to discuss a little bit about Innocent III. From there, we will talk about the decline of the papal power. We'll watch a video regarding one of the councils. Then we'll talk about the Black Plague. And then, so keep in mind that today we're staying up till 10. And I'll try to see if I can finish a little bit sooner so that we don't have to stay the whole time. But next week, we'll talk about the Reformation era, conclude with that. That one covers a little bit less years than this present era. And then on our last class, in 2 weeks, we will discuss the modern church or the postmodern church. So Innocent III held very high expectations on the church and on the governing systems. He got into office at the age of 37. He was very young. And he wanted to get rid of imperial power. He was tired of all of these political forces that were stopping him from spreading the gospel all over the world. So his goal was to spread the gospel, and he believed that imperial forces or governing forces were hindering him from doing that. If you look at it from a different perspective, he wants more power. so that he can control these ruling forces. So one never knows the official hearts of these people, but their actions speak highly of them. And Innocent III is famous because he began to choose the emperor. So they began to assign people for their specific positions, and he chooses Emperor Otto of Brunswick. He assigns him as emperor of the empire. Unfortunately, because the Pope is still the lead, even though he has an emperor, he's still the one in charge. He decides to get rid of Emperor Otto of Brunswick. So he assigns the emperor, and then he gets rid of him. That's the power that the popes are possessing during this time period now. They're able to assign the rulers. They're able to change all the political system. And Innocent III highlights on this by appointing the emperor and getting rid of him. Another thing that he's known for is he further conquers the city of Rome. And once again, he now creates rules for the officials. He's beginning to create political policies on all of these territories that they're taking over, all these territories that belong under the Roman Catholic Church. This is the western part of Europe. And Rome officially becomes the first state under papal power. So there's that massive switch from Constantine's time where Christianity was the official religion, or where Christianity was legalized under Theodosius. It was the official religion of Rome, but now Rome is the official city of the church. You see that dichotomy switch and how it just reverts from now, instead of the state being the largest political power, now the church is the largest political power. And when I talk about the submission of the French king, I mentioned earlier that the popes were going to begin to exhort and challenge the rulers. In regards to emperor, to the ruler of the French king, it's Philip Augustus, and he calls out and almost excommunicates him for an unrighteous divorce. So the papal ruler, or the Pope, is now challenging the positions and the authority of the ruling king. And he does this in France with Philip Augustus. And then he also excommunicates the English king, John of England. He excommunicates him so that the crown, or the royal position, belongs to the church. As soon as he does that, he allows him into the church. And he only did that so that the position of King of England could be part of the church. So you can see how powerful and influential the popes are, that they're removing people's positions. The people who live, the citizens of these countries, will follow these decisions, even if it means small changes like that. But of course, they're doing it so that the church can consolidate all the power. Whether the church had the title of king or not, the Pope was still making the decisions. But they did it so that the state can know and the citizens can know that the church was the ultimate authority in Europe. So he develops regional political powers, but at the same time, now he's politically holding these kings hostage by excommunicating them, and they're taking advantage of this excommunication power. So you can see the corruption already in the papal powers, where they're using their authority to expand Christianity, but it's more of expanding their role as political leaders, which is why it's regarded, in some places they're regarded as the Dark Ages. We don't use that term in history anymore because there was a renaissance of art. There was a lot of cultural developments. It was all church related. Of course, the church is in charge. So they don't call it the Dark Ages anymore, but you can tell that there's a very oppressed age because of church leaders taking advantage of the situation. So that's Innocent III. Let's take a look at the decline of the papal powers. In 1303, Boniface forbids Edward, who is now the King of England, to tax church property. So he tells the King of England, you can't tax us. And the king didn't agree to it immediately. So they begin to negotiate, and they get into a compromise. So now you can see that because Edward stood his ground, the Pope didn't have any power over him. So as they begin to negotiate, they get a compromise that results in priests and bishops had to give a portion of their incomes to the kingdom. So they agreed that the church wasn't going to be taxed, or the church they weren't going to tax church property, but priests and bishops had to give a portion of their income to the kingdom. Seems like a reasonable trade. They fought a war with France. Philip, the Friar of France, he went to war with them, and they threw the Pope in prison. He was released, and they died from grief. So from 1305, France was now under French authority. A lot of the excommunications were ignored. A lot of the orders that the popes were given were ignored by all these kings. So in the 1300s, you're gonna see a development of political leaders who resist the king's power, or the pope's power. Sorry, you're gonna see a lot of kings who get into power and they reject the decisions of the pope. Once again, they're arguing for separation of church and state, but when they do this, they mean that the state has power. Edward III orders the papal out of England. So he forbids the Pope to be in England. Then in 1377, the reigning Pope Gregory XI returns to Rome. And in 1414, the Council of Constance was held to decide one of the four popes. So now we have a pope in Rome, we have a pope in Constantinople, you have the Pope of the Orthodox Church. All four of these popes were rejected, and they elected a new one. So let us explore a little bit of the Council of Constance. I have a video that starts off kind of weird, but he has a great development of what actually happened in the council. I thank you for being patient with all these videos. Once again, I tell you my medieval history because he covers 1,000 years, and I wanted to be able to cover those 1,000 years in a few hours. I felt that it would do more justice if we had people who are medieval historians cover them a little bit more. So,
hello, Internet. In today's study on interesting history, we're going to be in the small southern German city of Constance in the year 1414, where a man rose in the great city hall and declared the economical meeting of the church open. It would take 4 years fighting inside the meeting hall with the cardinals and a German king promising to horsewhip every last one of them before the meeting was be able to close again. Then again, it's not every day the church have to figure out what to do with all 3 popes they currently have on their hands. So yeah, enjoy. So how did it get to that? Well, we need to begin in 1307, where Philippe the Beautiful, or Philip the Good of France, destroyed the Knight Templar order. For some years, Philip, who owed the knights a great deal of money, have wanted to deal with them. But, of course, you don't just declare war on what is both the most famous order of holy knights in the Western and Christian world, but also a fairly powerful state within a state that can possibly even resist your most potent of armies. To do that, you need to be subtle, and you need papal support. However, Philip was nothing if not determined, and after a few years where various popes died suddenly and mysteriously, he succeeded in having his own candidate elected, and very, very shortly after he struck, the Knight Templars was destroyed. This, however, for the Council of Constance was only a sort of distant beginning. What really mattered was that the popes under French control moved to Avion from Rome, and there sat for almost 70 years in the papal palace, completely under French dominion, which of course helped the French during political issues, but also put the popes in a very strange position where they were almost seen as tools rather than as Christian pontiffs. Then, 70 years later in 1377, the then sitting Pope Gregory XI decided to return the pontiff's seat to Rome. He moved himself and all the papal court back to the Vatican, but died shortly afterwards. Another pope, Urban VI, was elected, but a large group of church lords, particularly a lot of French church lords and cardinals, then gathered back together in Avion because they didn't like him and elected anti-pope Clement II, who then sat at Avion like they had for a while. That, of course, split Europe between the popes, which also, you can imagine, worsened the secular diplomatic situation of a Europe that was already riveted at the time by the 100 Years' War and various other situations. England, Germany, most of the Nordics supported the Pope in Rome, while French, Spaniards, and certain Italians decided that the Avion Pope was the one to deal with. This lasted for a while, but in 1409, a council was then held at Pisa to trying to fix the situation by determining the correct pope. They decided that none of the sitting popes at the time was probably the right one and elected their own. So yeah, since none of the others had promised to abdicate or anything, we now had 3 popes to deal with. This was not an improvement. Shortly after Pisa, however, Sigismund, the king of Hungary, also became king of Germany and decided that his goal for the future was become Holy Roman Emperor. However, to do that, of course, he needed united papal support, and especially since he also needed to deal with some rebellion Hungarian Hussites, religious followers of the church reformer Jan Hus. So, what to do? Well, another council obviously had to be called. Sigismund had support from such prominent church leaders as Jean Chasson and Pierre Daly in France, and eventually in 1414, the Council of Constance was called to decide what to do with John the 23rd, Gregory the 12th, and Benedict the 13th, and hopefully finally bring the Great Western Schism under control and reunite the Catholic Church. The council itself was held in Sigismund's territories in Constance, in south of Germany, a small town of about 4,000 inhabitants, which nearly doubled in size as 600 meeting participants, plus servants, soldiers, various dependents, visitors, and other associates arrived. Evil rumors will know that eventually there were more prostitutes in town than there had originally been women. However, that might just be typical medieval propaganda. For the first long while, the council itself had great difficulties getting things done. Oh, there were talkings and discussions, and everyone was united in trying to figure out what to do. The problem was that France and England was fighting the 100 Years' War, so they were not quite as keen on cooperating, especially since one of the most powerful French noblemen had allied with the English against their own insane king. Also, Sigismund was fighting with the Italian city-states. The various popes were fighting with each other. Basically, the first year or year and a half or so was utter chaos, with at one point Sigismund storming out of the meeting shouting to the world, "They will give me an Italian pope, those cardinals. By God, I will horsewhip them all before seeing it happen." In 1415, however, the British defeated the French at Agincourt, and the peace treaty afterwards led to, if not friendlier relationships between those two countries, but a strengthened alliance between the English and the Germans. And also at this point, the discussions had reached the point where 2 of the 3 sitting popes, Gregory and John, agreed to abdicate and step down. At this point, the council decided to try to focus on reforming the church internally, while Sigismund diplomatically tried to work with France and Spain to remove support from the remaining antipope, Benedict. It was also at this point that he achieved a certain degree of success, though it would later come back to bite him in the ass, when the council summoned Jan Hus to be tried for heresy, and despite giving him a promise of free passage, burned him at the stake. This, as you can imagine, did not sit well with his followers, and Sigismund would in fact spend almost the entire rest of his career fighting Hussite rebellions in his hard lands of Hungary. However, it did provide him with an immediate boost of popularity, and with the French internal problems papered over and the English and German and Northern nations uniting in a stronger alliance, it did give Sigismund enough clout that by 1470 he had managed to politically isolate Benedict XIII enough that even though he refused to step down and sought refuge with some Catalan noblemen who were still following, the council could agree to basically ignore him and elect Martin V as the new unopposed single pope of the Catholic Church. The council at this time tried to turn to internal reforms of the more obvious deficiencies within the church. However, Martin, who had, after all, just been elected as the United Pope, were more interested in re-establishing full papal authority, and despite the reform movement desperately trying to tell him that either we did something or there would be big problems down the line, it eventually subsided, and in 1418 the meeting finally came to a close and everyone left to go home. And finally, a couple of years later, Martin could crown Sigismund as the Holy Roman Emperor. So, success, or what? So why exactly was the Council of Constance so interesting? Well, first of all, obviously, it ended the Great Schism, which has torn Europe into two, well, in fact, three for a short while, for almost 100 years. Well, more than 100 years, actually. It also was the first time during the council history that the national voting blocks became a thing. Usually it just meant that the individual cardinals voted and spoke in whatever alliances they decided might be proper. This time, however, people voted with the nations they sat from, which also meant, of course, that since the English cardinals altogether had one vote, they mattered as much as the French cardinals and the Italian cardinals and the Spanish cardinals and so on, which meant that the Italians couldn't dominate as they always had, because there were about as many of them as there was of anyone else during the entire council. Combining this with the famous Haec Sancta resolution the council adopted in 1415, which stated that during crisis of the church and in moral and ordinary questions, the council itself would actually stand above the Pope, because the church as a body had greater authority than any single bishop, Bishop of Rome or otherwise. It created the height of the conciliary movement that would turn the church from a single man rule, as it had become, into a more of a conciliary movement where everything was to be determined in council and with all the people having something to say. This could might in fact have turned the Catholic Church into an early sort of democracy. This failed, of course, when Martin re-established full papal authority, but it's interesting to note that a lot of the reforms that this council was working with might in fact possibly have stopped the Reformation 100 years later dead if the council had allowed or been allowed to establish these reforms as facts and also to create a overarching authority that wasn't depending on just the given beliefs of the Pope at any given time. Many of the issues that Martin Luther and other later reformers and Reformation leaders were complaining about were actually being discussed at the Council of Constance, but never, of course, adopted in the end. And there we are, the Great Council of Constance, who succeeded strongly in its primary goal of reuniting the Catholic Church, but failed in its stated goal of also trying to, well, modernize it, reform it, and make it something that could last unopposed. In many ways, you can actually see this council as sort of the forerunner for the secularization of the Europe that had otherwise been crushed in the last couple of centuries, but would later find its greatest achievements during the Renaissance and later modern period. In some ways, you can say that depending on how you look at it, the way the council was set up in nation voting blocks, this could be seen as a sort of very early point of when nationalism as a concept started to have actual meaning in Europe for the first time, basically since the fall of the Roman Republic. So basically a very interesting place. If you want to know more, I would suggest you read either Crowder and his Unity, Heresy and Reform, or Loomis and his The Council of Constance and the Reunification of the Church, or perhaps even if you can handle a bit of Latin or find a decent translation, go directly to Jean Chasson himself, who had his diary published. He was a participant in the meeting and a leading reformer of his time. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. Next time we return to history, we will talk about one of the greatest Danish Viking families, Ragnar Lothbrok and his sons. We will be in Paris, we will be in England, we will be in Scandinavia, and we will have a poem about pigs. Until then, I have been the Sage, and have a good day.
He's so enthusiastic about history. I love it. All right. So he talks a lot about the concepts behind this council. And I want us to realize that we're now getting towards an era. So after Innocent III, after the downfall of the decline of the papal power, and right before or during the Council of Constance, we have an issue called the Black Plague. And the Black Plague, or the Black Death, the bubonic plague, however you want to refer to it, the Black Plague, the bubonic plague, or the Black Death, they're all the same. It was a devastating global epidemic that struck Europe and Asia in the mid-1300s. The plague arrived in Europe in 1347. There were 12 ships from the Black Sea that docked in the Sicilian ports. And as people gathered on the docks to meet these sailors, they found a very horrifying surprise. Most of the sailors on the ships were dead, and those that were alive were covered in black boils. They had blood sticking out, they had pus, and they were ill. They ordered these fleets of deaths out of the harbor, but it was too late. People had become contaminated, and over the next 5 years, the Black Death would kill more than 20 million people in Europe, almost 1/3 of the population. So the Black Plague was the coronavirus before the coronavirus, of course. I had to make the reference, sorry, I couldn't help myself. But it was bad, killed 1/3 of the population. Speaking of which, I just got an email during our break that my school is canceled because of the infections that are in the infections that are in the coronavirus infections in the area. Give me a second. I have a picture to show you guys about the Black Plague. See if I can pull it up. Here. All right, I'm gonna pull it up a different way. I have a video to show you guys about the Black Plague and how it affected the church in particular. How do I? Okay. So obviously the reason why the Black Plague expanded was because they didn't have the same hygienic principles that we do. They still they didn't understand the need for sanitary washing their hands. It's crazy that even now we're in 2020 and people still don't know the importance of washing their hands and how it's become a global phenomenon now. And it's like we've been knowing about that for years. So this is historically inaccurate, but it's to make you guys laugh. It's a meme that they made about the Black Plague. Let's see. One of the common reasons why the Black Plague expanded was because of rodents. So I'm not sure if you're able to see that picture, but bam. So there's a bit of history humor and Avengers humor for you. So let me show you guys a video of how the Black Plague affected the church. And specifically this.
How did people try to cure the plague? Flagellant, 14th century, European continent. The Black Death, more commonly known as the bubonic plague, swept through Europe beginning in the mid-14th century. However, this was not the first instance of the bubonic plague in the Middle Ages. Rumors about the Great Pestilence reached the European continent all the way from the Middle East and Asia before the plague itself was brought by ship. The plague wrought contagion, horror, and death among the people of Europe from the time it landed in Sicily, gradually spread over the continent and even to the British Isles. The bubonic plague is characterized first by swelling lymph nodes in the armpits and groin, known as buboes. These buboes would swell to the size of an egg, sometimes even to the size of an apple, bringing severe pain to the victims. The next stage of the sickness was the pus and blood that would seep from the swellings. This was followed by terrible aches and pains, fever, vomiting, and diarrhea. People at the time had no idea how the plague spread, believing that even touching the victim's clothing would cause contagion. However, the true cause of the plague were the fleas carried between houses by people and animals, specifically rats. The contagion spread throughout the continent as healthy people fled into the countryside and across the English Channel, trying to escape infection. But in reality, they were bringing the infected fleas with them. The plague spread quickly throughout Europe, killing up to 50 million people and infecting even more. Due to the intensity and horror of the Black Death, without a plausible explanation at the time, people in the Middle Ages cast blame on a variety of things, the largest of which being the wrath of God. In the middle of the 14th century, some people believed the way to appease God's wrath was to kill those they saw as heretics. This meant that thousands of Jews, foreigners, the impoverished, and other religious pilgrims were killed in an attempt to please God. However, while some people tried to cure the plague by punishing others, some tried to cure it by punishing themselves. This form of religious self-punishment was known as flagellation. It experienced a revival on a new scale because of the Black Death. Flagellant groups emerged in Italy, Eastern Europe, Germany, and the Low Countries, and spread throughout Europe. Flagellants were religious zealots who tried to atone for their sins, and therefore cure the plague through public displays of penance. This atonement was based on the imitation of the way Jesus suffered as he was whipped by Roman guards before being crucified for the sins of the world. The flagellants would whip themselves publicly several times a day, traveling to different towns in a procession every 33.5 days, gaining more followers in each town they went to. Some groups of flagellants differentiated themselves from other citizens by wearing hoods over their faces to expose their backs to show their wounds. This provided an element of modesty and humility into the act of flagellation. They were not to be viewed or worshipped as holy beings themselves, but their actions were meant to be viewed as atonement for the sins of all humanity. The whips consisted of 3 leather cords that had knots on each end, which sometimes had metal nails or iron spikes embedded, so that the flagellant would draw even more blood and possibly atone even deeper for their worldly sins. Flagellant's blood could be seen spattering walls, roads, and bystanders, and some saw the blood as a holy relic. Eventually, Pope Clement VI condemned the action of the flagellants as heretical because he viewed them as potential usurpers of Catholic power and caused trouble and instilled false hope. On October 20th, 1349, the flagellant movement was officially condemned in a bull, and church leaders were ordered to suppress it. With the end of the bubonic plague in the late Middle Ages, the flagellant movement had all but disappeared. However, it was not the flagellants and their actions who cured the plague. Sanitation and cold weather finally killed off the remnants of fleas carrying the plague, leaving the European population devastated but still surviving.
So that was pretty interesting to see how the church wanted to respond to this sanitary issue with, whipping themselves and disciplining themselves. I took a medieval era history class back like 2 or 3 years ago, like I mentioned last week, and my history professor did not cover the bubonic plague at all. He simply covered the flagellants, flagellants, whatever you pronounce it. And I thought that was really interesting because the early monks were disciplining themselves, believing that it was a way to purge themselves of sins, and it was a discipline that they believed was going to help them save the world. And in that case, we saw, once again, 1/3 of the population died because of fleas and bad hygiene practices. Here's a short announcement for you guys. Please wash your hands and use hand sanitizer. It'll help you, and it'll avoid another plague. Anyways, I told you guys to get us off subject. We're going to talk a little bit about Islam, and that's how we're going to conclude our class of Christian church history. We're going to just conclude it with talking about Islam so that we can talk about the Crusades. Next week, once again, we'll talk about the Crusades and the continual rise of monasticism. Then we'll get into one of my favorite parts of church history, which is the Reformation era. And once we're done with Reformation, we get into the modern era. So we're close to landing. Just to remind you as well, the final project or final writing is due the last week of class on the Friday of. So Islam, I'm not a huge expert on Islam. I know briefly about it from previous history classes or just some side thing that I've done. It was a religion that was founded by Muhammad. He was born in Mecca in Arabia in 570 AD. This is 570 AD, so it was in the beginning of the era that we were discussing. And he began preaching at the age of 40. As he began preaching, it slowly gained traction and began to convert several people. But it also had persecution, not at the great lengths that Christian persecution had, but it wasn't a religion that was accepted. He was very good at converting Arabic tribes. It's a region that we haven't covered, just slightly east of Jerusalem and towards that peninsula. And he ends up conquering Mecca. So Muslims haven't always the Muslims are not known as relatively peaceful people. They've always used force in order to convert people. And when he died in 632, when Muhammad died in 632, he was a respected prophet throughout all the regions. So he was a military conqueror as well as a prophet. And the main idea of Islam, the word Islam translates to submission, obedience to the will of God. That's where you get the word Muslim or Muslim, somebody who's obedient to the will of God. So I will quickly just explore a little bit of the Islamic doctrines. They believe in unity under God. So they refer to Christians and Jewish people as people of the book. They believe that we stem from the same God, or they believe that we have the same God. They believe that their God named Allah is the same as Elohim, which is the Jewish name for Jehovah or for God. And they believe that all events and everything has been foreordained by God. So similar to Augustus, they believe that God is the ruler of the heavens and the earth, that God has established everything and nothing goes against what he's already created. In regards to angels, they believe that there's angels who are good and bad. So as well as we do, we believe in fallen angels, which are demons. They believe in a multitude of angels that are good or bad, and they're invisible, but they're dealing with people. So they're tempting people, they're destroying lives, etc., etc. Their religious texts, we have the Bible. They use the Quran, and the Quran is God's message delivered to Gabriel, from Gabriel to Muhammad. So Muhammad got a message from Gabriel, delivered from God. And these thoughts and these ideas are not collected until after he's dead. So the Quran isn't put together until Muhammad dies. They believed in prophets. They believed in Adam. They believed in Moses. They believed in most of the Older Testament prophets. They just viewed them simply as prophets. But they also believed in the prophet Muhammad. In regards to Jesus, they viewed Jesus as a prophet as well. He was a man that was very wise, according to them, but he wasn't a god, and he wasn't God. And all of these people are recognized as saints. So they're recognized by the Islamic community as saints. There will be a final resurrection. There's going to be judgment, and above all, there is a heaven and a hell for every man. So those are the quintessential ideas behind the Islamic community and their beliefs. Once again, I'm not an expert. I haven't read large portions of the Quran. I've only read glimpses of it. So I just wanted us to get an idea of the rising competing religions. Remember, when Christianity started, Judaism was the biggest rival, and paganism. Eventually, Judaism takes a dip because most of them are converting to Christianity, and the biggest challenge is paganism. But paganism becomes outlawed and becomes marginalized when Christianity takes a larger role in Rome. So right now, the main faith is Christianity and some smaller pagan tribal traditions, but those aren't large enough to compete against Christianity. So you get the institution or the creation of Islam that comes and poses a threat to the growth of Christianity. And we're going to see when we talk about the Crusades next week, where they literally battle for pieces of land, or they fight in physical warfare so that they can obtain certain land and religious institute or religious power and authority. They figured that if the church was able to control, then they would also be able to control religiously and politically. So next week we will cover the Crusades, and we will also cover the further development of monasticism. So those are the two things that we're going to be talking about next week. And then that will lead us into the Reformed Church. We're going to talk about the fall of Constantinople and the end of the 30 Years' War. And from there, we will talk about Reformation in Germany, Reformation in other places such as Sweden, and certain principles of Reformation or why it developed. So that'll be for next week. For now, I just want to remind you that your assignment is due the last week of our class, which is the 23rd. So we have the 16th where we're going to be discussing the Reformed Church and the ending of the medieval church, and the 23rd we discuss the modern church. On the 27th at 11:59, I'll have received all of your final essays. Do we need to go over the syllabus again, or you guys all have it, right? Good. Okay. So yeah, submit that essay for me on the 23rd to my email. And then your homework for tonight, we're going to read chapters 18, 19, and 20. Read chapters 18, 19, and 20. And then I want us to read, actually, since we're going to be talking about the Crusades, let's read part of the Quran. I'm not trying to convert you. Don't think that I'm trying to convert you. I'm not. I want us to be a little open to see what they have. So, let's see.
Brother, come on, ¿qué pasó?
Uh,
Yeah, yeah. Okay, I'll read it.
You guys are gonna judge me for this. Wait, like 2 seconds. I like historical documents. So in my bookshelf here in my office, I have a Bible, and right next to the Bible, I have this. It's really boring. I have to have all these historical sources. I'm actually planning on ordering like all the religious texts just so I can have copies of it. Once again, as much as I am a theologian, I'm also a historian, so I find reading these things, they're not really interesting. I think the Quran is actually more interesting than the Book of Mormon. But anyways, so let's see. Let's read. Let me see what will interest you guys in the. Read chapter 5. Let me send you an email. There's a lot of verses on here. Oops. So we're reading chapters 18, 19 of Hurlburt. 18, 19, 20, is it right? 18, 19, 20. Hurlburt. And then I'm sending you the copy of the Quran, chapter 5. We'll read the first. Read the first 40 verses. It's a quick read. Read the first 40 verses. We're going to spend time discussing the first 40 verses of the Quran, and I want us all to participate. So make sure you read that one for sure. And we're going to do some comparisons of the Quran and the Bible and point out all of their flaws and stuff. So that'll be fun. Once again, I'm not trying to convert you. If you do convert for whatever reason, I will ask God for forgiveness and your families and your church and everybody else.
Ya dijiste, bro.
I've never heard of somebody convert from Christianity to Islam.
Me neither.
I've only heard stories of the opposite.
Yes, that's what I heard too. So
I've heard of somebody who converted from Christianity to Judaism. That was interesting.
Oh, that's weird. Yeah.
Or like from denomination to denomination because of slight differences, but
yeah.
All right. So that's it. We're going to end off with Islam because that's going to be our start for the next class, which will lead us into the Crusades. Once again, I'm looking at key moments in church history. The book is going to give you a lot of smaller ideas, which is why I had you guys watch the videos. I want to focus on the broader ideas because the way that the text is set up is where we're covering 900 to 1,000 years of history, and he doesn't do justice to the way that the Black Plague affected people. He doesn't do justice to the schisms that you're reading and there's a few movements or moments that I wanted to explore with you guys. So with that being said, that concludes our class for today. Does anybody have any questions? Okay, if you do have questions for whatever reason, you can always email me, text me. And I recorded my lecture that I was giving Juan Pablo from, it was lecture number 1. And I also recorded the lecture that I gave Sarai for lecture number 1. So I have to send that to Josh. And I'll make that available for all of you if you want to redo lecture number 1 or just watch it. And I also recorded tonight's lecture, even though it was mostly videos. I did that because for the student that wasn't able to make it, I wanted to help him out with that. So that's it for tonight.